Sometimes the picture taking is not necessarily pornographic, but it can still be problematic. These two doctors are twins, you can probably tell that, and they were recently convicted about a year and a half ago. I testified at their trial of sexually abusing their patients. They were, how can I put it, they were amateur photographers for all of the sporting teams in their community for 15 years. Every team that was a boy team. The swim teams, the wrestling teams, the basketball teams, football teams, they took thousands and thousands of photographs. And they would send, the best photograph catching the touchdown and all that to the coach. They would provide all the little trophies at the end of the year of all the sporting events. But what no one knew was that at home, they had the other photos they had taken with their telephoto lenses. They had the pictures of the little boys who were squatting down as the catchers and giving the signals in between their legs. Of course, the telephoto lens was really focused in between the legs of the child. They had pictures of basketball players taking their jersey bottoms off as they were getting ready to play, but the real purpose of that picture was the fact that they were taking their clothes off. They had thousands, 45,000 pictures in their home of kids in this manner. And it was a very, very big case because these were well-loved pediatricians in their community. But this was child erotica. This was not child pornography, so they weren't really, they were not prosecuted for having these images, but you can understand what those images meant once you began to recognize that they were also sexually abusing their kids. The reason they got caught was because the boys that they started sexually abusing in their own clinics, who were boys from dysfunctional families, they would give money to. At the age of 12, they would give $200 to a child in their office. First, they would excuse the mother by saying, he's a boy now and he's getting bigger, so he should have a checkup by himself. And then when the mother would leave and say, okay, doc, whatever you say, then they would sexually abuse the boys and they would give them $200, which is a lot of money for any 12-year-old. So the boys would come back as they would tell them to, until even by the age of 14, they didn't want to come back, not even for the money. So what they began to do was to write narcotics for these boys, Xanax, MS-Contin, highly addictive narcotics, making these boys eventually quite addicted, so the boys would come back to be able to get the narcotics from the pediatricians. It was the DEA who noticed their narcotic writing practices and decided to contact some of the recipients of the narcotics, thinking that these pediatricians had drug habits and they were just writing the prescriptions for themselves, which some people will do. And the patient will go get it filled and then just bring it back to the doctor and they're good to go. That is sometimes what happens with drug-addicted healthcare providers. They were very shocked to discover that that wasn't the case at all. What was happening was that these doctors were continuing to pay money for these same boys in order to have sex with them. So one of the concepts you need to understand is vulnerability, children who are vulnerable. Definition: capable of being wounded, susceptible to wounds, or already wounded. And liable to increased penalties. So youth who have been in dysfunctional homes, kids who are grown up with intimate partner violence, that's what IPV stands for, drug abuse, parental mental illness, child abuse, neglect, child sexual abuse victims, foster care placement, children that have mental health care problems, learning disabilities, gender identity issues, foreign national children, and highly impoverished families. Some of these children will surely be coming to some of your camps. There's no doubt that they will be coming to your camps. They are more vulnerable.
Actually pretty easy. You can go into any chat room and just start talking. Most of the girls are usually so insecure and desperate for attention.
Attention from older guys is totally flattering, but so much more mature and understanding than the guys my age.
Age actually works to my advantage. They like to brag to their friends that they're dating older guys, so I just play along and pretend I'm really
Interested in the same things I am. You can talk forever and really get to know someone without worrying about looks or whatever. That's the best thing about
chatting seems unthreatening to them, so they lower their guard. After a while, I start talking about how we're soulmates and how lucky we are to have found each other.
Other people don't understand. I know what I'm doing. If you really care about each other, there's nothing wrong with me.
Meeting them is the goal. Once I get them out of their house, well, that's when things get really interesting.
Online predators know what they're doing. Do you?
So this is a PSA for children, and the Department, OJJDP, Department of Justice and Juvenile Delinquency Prevention, has these PSAs online. as an organization, you could easily access the PSAs that are for children and use them as a springboard for discussions and conversations at your camps. For internet safety, to help children become empowered to be safer online, to not be pulled into situations that could, in fact, cause them to be at risk. Like this victim. This victim is Justin Berry. Justin Berry now, I was just with him recently on the Dr. Phil show, but this is what Justin Berry looked like when he was 13. And this is when he was exploited by multiple offenders as a boy who were, he was cyber enticed.
Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Mr. Stupak, and other members of the committee, my name is Justin Berry, and I am 19 years old. I'm here to speak about danger facing this nation's children, one that threatens not only their emotional health, but their physical safety. This danger is internet child pornography, particularly involving the use of inexpensive web cameras, which are used by adult predators to exploit children. I speak from experience. For 5 years, beginning when I was 13 years old, I operated a pornographic website featuring images of myself loaded onto the internet by webcams. I was paid by more than 1,000 men to strip naked, masturbate, and even have sex with female prostitutes while on camera. My business was assisted by adult criminals, including companies that process credit card payments. I'm not proud of the things I've done, nor will I personally attempt to avoid responsibility for those decisions. While I did not comprehend the magnitude of what was happening when I was 13, as I grew older, I progressively became corrupted and acted in shameful ways. Still, I repeatedly attempted to pull away from this sick business. But each time, I fell back into this criminal world that at first seduced me and eventually controlled me.
I would encourage you to read the story about Justin Berry. All you have to do is to go onto Google and write in Justin Berry and the word Eichenwald, E-I-C-H-E-N-W-A-L-D. Kurt Eichenwald was the New York Times reporter who helped Justin Berry be able to come and testify before Congress. The New York Times found out about Justin, and they talked to him and said, don't you want to help other kids not fall prey to this? And he said yes. And at that time, Justin Berry did indeed have more than 1,000 credit card accounts information from people who were coming online all the time offering to pay him money so that they could just see him on a webcam. And he turned that information over to the Department of Justice on the grounds that he would get immunity because he was an underage minor for almost the whole time that this was happening to him, and he didn't, of course, didn't want to go to prison. He got immunity, and the New York Times paid for his legal representation to make sure that he would be safe from that perspective. And when he testified before Congress, that's the first time that I testified before Congress. I had to give some background testimony before he testified. And one of the offenders who had met him online, who was a 39 or 45-year-old man, had actually moved to the town where Justin lived and rented an apartment about 2 blocks away from Justin's house so that he could try to groom Justin to coming to his apartment. He put all these video game arcade equipment in his house to just try to get him to come and think he could just come and have fun there. But the reality was he was trying to groom Justin so that he could sexually abuse him. So the relationship of people who do exploit children, 38% are the parents, 10% are other relatives, 26% are neighbors and acquaintances. This is National Center for Missing Exploited Children data. And it helps us to understand this difference. In child sexual abuse, the child doesn't make a disclosure till they're ready. It's their secret. For boys, they often feel they've been betrayed. But in child sexual exploitation, you have, in fact, instead of in child sexual abuse where you have one victim and one offender, in child sexual exploitation you have one victim and multiple offenders, like a hyena, like hyenas that come around a wounded or vulnerable victim. We know that these one victims and multiple abusers are what victims have told us. Another victim says these perverts spread their victims around because they meet kids online and then they hook them up with other people that they already are networking with. This is Alicia Kazakevich, who in fact is also testifying before Congress.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name is Alicia Kazakevich. A Pittsburgh resident, I am 19 years old and a sophomore in college. And for the benefit of those of you who don't remember those headlines, I am that 13-year-old girl who was lured by an internet predator, transported across state lines to Virginia, in fact, not so very far from here, and enslaved by a sadistic pedophile monster. The authorities told my parents that the odds were 1,000,000 to 1 against my recovery. But I was the exception. I got the miracle. I was rescued. So why me? Because I was blessed by the simple fact that I live in Pittsburgh, where one of the very best cybercrime task forces was created. And because I was enslaved in Virginia, where one of the best internet crimes against children task force, or ICAPs, exists. Because they had the training, the knowledge, and the expertise to find that needle in the haystack. That was a lost little girl. That was me. Because they had the cooperation of another fine ICAC team here in Virginia. Because they were there. I am here. They're the only reason that I'm here in front of you today. But I want you to know that I am not up here alone. Beside me, there are so many young girls whose stories will never be heard because they are dead, possibly enslaved, or just too terrified to speak out. When I speak, what I say is for all of us who exist in pain and fear and sometimes even shame, and for those of us who have been silenced by the grave.
So Elisa Kazakevich was groomed by a girl online, a girl named Christine. And Christine became her BFF online. And for 6 months, Christine and Elisa were both 13-year-old girls. They would exchange pictures with each other and talk about school and report cards and all that kind of stuff and troubles with parents and whatnot. And after about 6 months, Christine said, I have a friend, his name is Scott. He's a really good guy, you know, he understands us. He's a grown-up, but he really understands us. I want to introduce you to him, all online. And so she did. She introduced Christina, to Scott, who was a guy named Scott Tyree, whose real screen name was Slave Master. That was his real, he was a sadistic sex offender. And Christine, it turned out, was a 46-year-old man who spent 6 months grooming Alicia for him. He was the person who would find young teenage girls or young, preteen girls and gradually groom them online. Alicia did not willingly ever go with Scott Tyree. Scott Tyree eventually convinced her, after talking to her for almost a year, online, always online, he convinced her that he just wanted to come and say hello to her on New Year's Day, New Year's night. So he drove up to her driveway at her house. She came from an upper middle class family in Pittsburgh, and Alicia, with no coat in the snow, went down her driveway just to meet this person that she'd been talking to online for almost a year. That's a pretty normal behavior. You wouldn't expect anything wrong if somebody drives to your driveway and you think you're going to get a chance to meet them. But what she didn't know was that he was a sadist, and he abducted her from her driveway that night, drove her to Herndon, Virginia from Pittsburgh, and spent the next 3 days viciously, sadistically abusing her and videotaping it all live to other offenders who were watching as he was doing that. She was ultimately, fortunately, rescued by the FBI because today, unfortunately, if a child goes missing, one of the first things that people think about is what has happened with their computer. Are they missing because they've run away, or are they missing because somebody has taken them? That's where we are today. And so Alicia was fortunately rescued. Alicia had a very difficult post-rescue period of time. She developed severe anorexia. She has had a lot of PTSD and anxiety, but she has managed to pull through. She's graduated from college, and she's doing a really good job keeping her life together. But it's a good example of how these kinds of cases can be. Because in cyber enticement cases, the kids are groomed into very sexualized beliefs that are not appropriate. They become the compliant victim. And sometimes meeting offline is that rite of passage that you see. And of course, all of you all remember To Catch a Predator. Oh, some of us remember that television series. Does anybody remember that television series? Yeah? Right, and this is I show you this particular one because here's a guy who has arrived at that house, the houses that were mic'd up and wired up, with his 5-year-old son, whom he only had for weekend visitation. He brings his 5-year-old son with him in order to have sex with a teenage girl. That's a good example of how driven some of these offenders can be. But I consider To Catch a Predator real reality TV, you know, as compared to the reality TV that we see now. I also mentioned to you the role of video games. This was probably the first time that we had heard of a case. It was in 2009 of a victim who was in a war game. She was not in any kind of sexually explicit game, no Grand Theft Auto, Vice City, or anything like that. She was in a game playing with a guy, and he at first had encouraged her to send pictures of herself, nude pictures of herself, and then when he really tried to push to meet her offline through that video game, she finally told her parents, and so he was arrested. I already mentioned the issue of looking at the types of sports and which ones are at higher risk for certain types of sexual crimes. Certainly swimming is one. And it was Barnardo's, a children's charity out of the UK, that has studied the most child pornography victims to find out why is it they don't tell. And they said, well, because sometimes these pictures just made it look like I just let it happen, or sometimes this person made me smile, so it looked like I was having a good time. Sometimes children didn't tell because they had to recruit other children to sleepovers, for example. I would encourage that you just web search Operation Hamlet if you get a chance. Operation Hamlet was a very large child pornography case out of Denmark where very young children, these were kindergartners, that's why it's called the kindergarten series. Very young children were being sexually abused by one person, the father of one of the children in their school. And none of these children, these are young children who don't really have the concept of secret that well intact. These children were sexually abused for over 2 years by this individual. We know because we've seen their pictures with them losing their baby teeth and their permanent teeth coming in, different haircuts and everything, still being sexually abused by this one offender. And in that school, there were 41 victims. Not a single child had ever told. Not a single in fact, they were found not because anybody ever told. Sometimes children don't tell because they are coerced to have a sexual contact with another child, or they're coerced to have autoerotic behavior such as masturbation. And the final reason that kids don't tell is because they're shown their own images and told that they will be in trouble for not having stopped the sexual abuse. So Microsoft and the National Center have now for about 6 years had special labs that they have at large law enforcement meetings where they show just background pictures, asking if anybody knows where this is. These pictures are all related to some case of child pornography where we don't know who the victim is. We know that there is a victim, we just don't know who the victim is. Such was the case with this particular picture. It was shown at one of the Microsoft labs, asking law enforcement officers, do you know anything about this picture? And a sheriff's deputy in Texas blogged in. He was very excited. I know this house. There was a woman there who had a 5-year-old child, and the child was being sexually abused by the woman's boyfriend. And we have taken this case to trial, and the offender's in prison. Everybody's really glad. However, why do we have this picture? Well, because this 5-year-old child's pictures are on the internet. Child pornography pictures of that 5-year-old child are on the internet, and no one knew it. Now we know who that victim is, but we also know that the offender who's in prison is not in prison for child pornography production. He's in prison for child sexual abuse, but not for child pornography. But child pornography production was part of her victimization, and this child had never told anyone about the picture part of her victimization. 10% of images on the internet are infants and toddlers. Infants and toddlers who are being sexually abused. Such was the case as this offender, a very high-profile offender. You remember this case out of Delaware, again a pediatrician, Earl Bradley, who had been sexually abusing multiple of his patients. He had over 140 victims, and the overwhelming majority of them were children less than 3. Why did he choose children in that age group? Because they're pre-verbal. They can speak, but they can't speak about this. You know, they're not going to be able to tell you so well. He was a very devious person, and that was really a very big case. I was working in that case as well. The impact on a family when their child has been exploited by an outside stranger is devastation. The family feels as if they failed their child, they failed to protect the child, they never ever get over it, I will tell you. And it's this failure to protect is what pushed Mr. Wilkie to kill himself. Remember I told you about the Wilkie family. In addition, when children have been sexually exploited and their images are on the internet, we have an act in our country called the Justice for All Act that says that if you've been a victim of a crime, you have a right to know. So if your child's pictures are on the internet, every time somebody else downloads that picture and gets arrested for that, a letter comes to your house telling you that somebody else has been downloading your child's picture of child pornography. And so you may, in fact, get 10 or 12 letters a month letting you know that people are still downloading pictures of your child. It's not going away. So some parents have opted to opt out from this notification so that they don't get any notification. But when the child turns 18, the law requires that the child be notified from that time on. And she or he would have to be the one to opt out of that notification that they're still being exploited in this manner. So the invasion of privacy has led to national restitution hearings with respect to these kinds of cases. I've already talked to you about Richard Estes and the issue of intrafamilial sexual exploitation, but I do want to give you a couple of case examples. Here's a dad who was selling his 7-year-old daughter on the internet by sending out pictures, encouraging people to come to his house to have sex with her, and a mom who was emailing nude pictures of her teenage daughter to individuals, negotiating with them to come to her house to have sex with the child. One of the individuals was a pediatrician from San Francisco that she was negotiating with. This is a Duke University health policy professor whose screen name was Perv Dad for Fun. And he was marketing not for money, but for networking purposes, his 5-year-old adoptive son to individuals whom he encouraged to come to Durham in order to have sex with his son. He would even tell the individuals what hotel to come to in Durham, and eventually he talked to an undercover agent, which is how he got caught. And then let me also mention that I mentioned already the whole issue of bullying that can happen at a camp setting with cell phone cameras. We talked about that this morning, you know, the whole documentation with cell phone cameras. Well, the purpose for doing that is as a form of sextortion, if it is a sexual act. And that's what happened in this case. A teenage boy from a school who took the Facebook picture of a girl in his class as him. He took on her identity. Started out as identity theft. So he pretended to be her, and he started talking to other boys in the class that he was hot for them, et cetera, encouraged these boys to send nude and sexually explicit pictures to him. And then after he did, he continued to be her, and finally said, well, let's get it on, let's go ahead and hook up. I'll meet you in the such and such a bathroom, et cetera. And in the end, he had 31 teenage victims whom he had sextorted. That's the term that you'll hear now in the literature, where you use sexual images in order to blackmail people into a sexual encounter. This was a very interesting case because he had all of these, at least 7 boys who had to perform sexual acts with him in school bathrooms, in the parking lot, and in some of the victims' homes, all by this one offender. So when we see sexual self-exploitation, sometimes it might be a little bit more than we think. This is the typology that's been given to us in our country by the Crimes Against Children's Research Center. They refer to sexting as youth-produced sexual images. And it's either because a kid is experimenting or they're for aggravated reasons. If the child is experimenting, it's because they have a romantic interest in somebody else, or they're sexually attention-seeking, or there's some other reason. But it's this category that we have to pay attention to, the aggravated category where an adult is involved. If an adult is trying to groom a child to send images, please, you know, just like with Justin Berry, all of these adults came on and said, send us a picture of you. They usually have an intent to harm the youth. If, on the other hand, it's a youth who is doing that, they may, in fact, use those images for reckless disregard.
Let's go! Hey, that's Sarah. Sarah in the picture, that's the girl I was telling you about. Oh, that's Sarah?
Theater 2 on your left. Hey, Sarah. What color underwear today?
Hey, Sarah. So when are you going to post something new?
Anything you post online? anyone can see. Family, friends,
See you later, Sarah.
even not so friendly people. Think before you post.
So I want to end our conversation today by, first of all, congratulating you for staying awake. It's always a challenge, but also by encouraging and challenging you to take the information that you've gotten today, I hope, back into your thought process on how you can really provide prevention by protecting children, but also what can you do proactively to help some of the children that you touch. You touch so many children, you have that opportunity. What can you do proactively for kids that will help them to be safe in their offline world and on their online world? This is a great opportunity to prevent sexual victimization through empowerment of youth, and also to prevent it by the safety standards and protection measures that you take at your organizational level and that you recommend to other organizations. I also would encourage you to become more knowledgeable regarding social norms, as they are challenging these days, but it is important for us to understand what children are experiencing, and so that if you're going to talk to youth-serving organizations, you have to have somebody who's a go-to person who understands what youth are doing these days, what are our typical behaviors, so that you can address those appropriately. And let me stop by asking you if you have any questions or comments about some of the things that we've talked about. We've talked a lot today, but hopefully it's been helpful information for you. So let me just stop and ask if you have any questions or comments on things that we did or did not talk about today. Yes?
This is sort of twofold for the kids that we work with in our camps, but also as a parent. Is
Yes.
there anything that you can direct us to specifically? Like, I mean, you've given us some good articles and cases to look at, but is there any, specific book or something that we can?
Yes, there are quite a few books that are written about sexualization of children. For example, there's a book called Too Sexy, Too Young that's about sexualization of boys and girls. And Levine is the author of that book, Levine. There's another book called The Sexualization of Childhood. It's written about, it has multiple speakers. These are essays that are written about some of the things that are happening to children today, so we have a better understanding. I would absolutely say that you should read the book Predators. Predators is by Anna Salter. It is a book that Anna Salter is a forensic psychologist whose job it is to evaluate people who are up for parole and to determine if they are such a threat. Even though they've served their sentence, are they too much of a threat to let them out in society? And so should they go from prison to civil commitment? Dr. Salter is outstanding, really highly respected individual. And her book Predators, which came out in 2004, is just chock full of research regarding offenders and offender information. And if there's one line from her book that I would quote, it would be her statement that being nice is a choice. She tries to bring that point out because people have so often said, oh, they couldn't have done that, they're so nice. And she wants people to understand that people who offend against children and adults, but especially against children, choose to be nice at the time that they want to be nice in order to get over. I would say Predators would probably be one of the best, though sobering, documents that you can read that would help you. The American Academy of Pediatrics has a child sexual abuse prevention model. And of course, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has quite a bit of online materials from that perspective as well. And I would also recommend that you read the APA report, the American Psychological Association report, the Task Force on the Sexualization of Girls. You can download it from the internet and you just type in APA Task Force Sexualization. Because it has, at the end of its report, several pages of countermeasures that organizations can take to try to bring childhood back to children, to try to encourage people not to see children as appropriate sexual partners. Those would be the primary references that I would send you to.
Are there any that are good for kids to read?
NetSmarts is good. NetSmarts has a lot of really good safety related stuff that includes sexual abuse as well as sexual exploitation. Other resources for children, There are quite a few children's books that are written for children. Serendipity has one that's called Never Talk to Strangers. It's a great book because it's all animals. Everybody in it is an animal, you know, who's talking, and they're talking about don't open the door, and, you know, there's a buffalo outside the door. You know, it's that kind of a book, but it's not a frightening book, and it's by Serendipity. That's the publisher of that. Any other questions or comments? I hope I didn't overwhelm you too much, but I think perhaps you've had some food other than that food, which was very good, for thought, and I thank you for your attention.